Hey guys, it's Everything's Lightly. Today, we got two guests that are gonna help me figure out something I've been thinking about. Have you ever wondered, if you didn't die, there would be no time? I know you're thinking that doesn't seem true, but it's absolutely true. But here's the thing, do we die? So if you're a Christian, and many other traditions, but if you're a Christian, you don't actually die, you fall asleep, you pass through. Wait a minute. If you're not dying, there aren't certain laws that you have to abide by if you actually are becoming something like eternal. And then you realize there's crazy stuff that can happen in the world. And then these two guys, Richard Rohlin, who's a philologist, you guys know him from Symbolic World. I think he's just about to become a deacon too. But Richard's Richard's the man. He's a historian. Then this other crazy guy, Matthew Namee, shows up. A really good Christian Orthodox historian who works over at OSI, Orthodox Studies Institute, and this has some really cool projects going. Well, they come together, the clash of the historical titans. Is church history just like all other histories? And can people in church history do stuff like bend time? Today on Everything's Lightly. This is a great matchup. I thank you guys for being here. I have a question. And then let's just have fun for 45 minutes with this concept. Is someone doing church history something like exactly doing what someone's doing American history? Are they engaged in the same process of providing people with the past in a way to make us, I don't know, learn something? Or is there something different about church history? I don't know. What do you think?
So, can I go? Because I have a fun story. Let me tell you
Gagi
about
Marjos, by the way. Cheers
Gagi
to you
Marjos.
guys.
Yeah, here we
Cheers
go.
to you guys.
Yeah. So, let me tell you about last week when I held Hitler's keys.
Who doesn't want to start with that?
I
That's
know. Okay, so it's out now, so I can talk about it. Glenn Beck, the Storm and Mormon. Do you guys know who Glenn Beck is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he invited Jonathan Peugeot and I out to his studios here in Irving last week so that he could have a conversation with Jonathan. And that conversation is up now on Glenn Beck's podcast. It was a really good conversation. And in general, I think Glenn was he was just a very good host. He was very humble, very charitable. He listened well. He asked good questions. He's very interested in us and kind of what our whole deal was. And anyways, it was great. It was a very unusual thing. I didn't have that on my bingo card for 2025. But then afterwards, Glenn said, "Well, do you guys want to see the vault?" Like, well, what's the vault? Obviously, I want to see the vault.
I want to see Glenn Beck's vault.
Glenn Beck has one of the largest collections of Americana and other artifacts, especially a lot of World War II and Cold War era stuff in the country. Like one of the largest personal collections. His curator, because obviously, if you have a personal museum, you got to have a curator, right? Told us that there's maybe over 100,000 artifacts in the collection. They're not all in one place, but they're kind of spread between different places.
Wow.
And so they took us on a tour through the vault, which had a bunch of crazy stuff in it. Obviously, the stuff I was the most interested in was the early American stuff. And so apparently the way that Glenn Beck got started with his collection was that there were some people, I think, associated with something called the 1619 Project that you're probably both familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a sort of attempt to rewrite American history, to say, to say certain things about American history and to say that those things are the core, that, racism, slavery, that these are actually essential parts of the American story, right? And so I guess in connection with this, somebody had started buying up these buying up things like papers that belonged to the founding fathers and like lots of early Americana and just started incinerating it. And I can't.
I didn't see that
Yeah,
coming.
it's pretty wild, and I can't tell you more about that without because I'm not I don't know everything about it.
Right.
I don't have like a citation for you or whatever. But anyway, this is what the curator of Beck's private museum told me. I have no reason to think he was fibbing or something like that. But anyway, people were buying up early Americana and destroying it, and so what Glenn Beck started doing was buying it up and preserving it
Mm-hmm.
and then making it available to historians and things like that. And so as we're going through his private museum there, we got to hold things like the first Bible ever printed in the United States, which included the Deuterocanon, by the way, which was fun.
Wow.
Also, one of the early Geneva Bibles that came over with the Puritans, which also included the Deuterocanon. In fact, when Jonathan cracked it cracked open right to the book of Esdras, which was pretty awesome.
The
I have a
book of
picture of that.
Esdras.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Um, and then we got to hold a bunch of these other things, including stuff like George Washington's personal surveyor's compass, which I got to hold with my hands. And I took a picture with it, and I haven't decided if I'm going to post it online or not because I think some people get like Masonic, ideas. Some people get really exercised about these things, but I did take a picture with it, and that was pretty cool. And things like a bunch of Washington's other personal papers, and like the spectacles he gave to Alexander Hamilton and stuff like that is all there, and
What
you
a
can just pick it up and
collection.
hold it all.
Wow.
Um, they have a draft of the Declaration of Independence there, that still has the paragraph that was eventually removed at the protest of two of the states about abolishing slavery. And anyway, all this other stuff. Well, one of the things they had there was a bunch of Lincoln stuff, and apparently, I actually found out later. Well, I'll tell that story some other time. But anyway, they had a bunch of Lincoln stuff and things like a key to Ford's Theater from the night when Lincoln was shot, and a lock of Lincoln's hair, and then actually the collar that had been cut off of Lincoln's jacket that still had his blood on it. And these things were preserved, like the fabric things were like pressed under glass, right? Um,
Yeah, these are
and then
relics.
also he had a bunch of World War II stuff, uniforms of Holocaust survivors, and then at one point we were kind of in the World War II section, and the curator picks up this big bunch of keys, like like old school iron, big keys,
Mm-hmm.
and puts them in my hand, and he says, "These are Adolf Hitler's personal keys to the Eagle's Nest." And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this information, right? Just like holding this in my hand.
That
Well,
was
then also like we had like Hitler's dinner set, and like his little port glasses and those little shot cup with his initials on it. One of Winston Churchill's cigars, which is a good thing that guy was behind glass because I would have lit that sucker up. And like, there's got to be nothing that would make you feel more powerful than smoking one of Churchill's cigars, I feel
yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well,
then
the keys to the Eagle's Nest is pretty good.
yeah,
It's pretty
right,
freaky.
right. It's pretty crazy. It's stuff like Tokyo Rose's microphone, one of FDR's wheelchairs, like all this kind of crazy stuff.
Is that just Glenn Beck's job these days? What does he
I
do?
don't
That's
I don't
incredible.
it's his hobby. I mean, he literally has Sputnik hanging one of like, Sputnik 2 is hanging over his desk in his office. I was like, "Oh, that's a cool Sputnik replica," and they're like, "No, no, no, that's not a replica.
That was Sputnik?
It was Sputnik." So, uh,
All
so
right. So
okay, so
hold
the
on
reason
though, Richard. Our
yeah.
our audience is wondering, you're getting to this church question. I feel it
No,
coming.
I am. I'm really close to making the transition here, John. You gotta
I
listen.
trust you. I
Listen,
trust
Trump
you.
is president now. I can do the weave, okay?
Fair
I
point.
can I can take my time with the
24
story
hours.
now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
24 hours.
so where I'm going with the question is, I think that something that really struck both Jonathan and I when we were there and we're holding some of these items in our hands, uh, especially like when you get to like, this thing has Lincoln's blood on it. And I made a little bit of a joke to our tour guide who's a Protestant. I made a little bit of a joke to him. I said, "Well, listen, if Lincoln was Orthodox, we'd like put this in a church and people would kiss it." And he kind of laughed nervously about that. And then I said, "Well, and I didn't really push this, but I thought about it. I thought about it. that, there is a temple to Abraham Lincoln in our nation's capital. And
Absolutely.
it's self-consciously a temple. It's not just modeled on classical temples, but if you walk up the stairs, I mean, it's a very impressive edifice. For my money, it's the most impressive thing in the Capitol. You walk up the stairs, and there's Lincoln enthroned as Zeus, on the throne with the fasces on either side of it. And then up behind him on the wall, it says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of those for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln will be forever enshrined," something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you think about just what that is saying, like on its face, with the plain meaning of the text, as we used to say in Protestant seminary, is very clearly Abraham Lincoln is in this temple, but he's also in your heart. And Lincoln saved you, and he saved this country, right? And it's a self-consciously religious kind of a thing. And
No
we
doubt.
have his relics. In fact, I've been to Lincoln's tomb, which is in Illinois. And if you go up there, up to Lincoln's tomb, there's a huge bust made out of copper, like a bunch of copper pennies melted down, and a huge bust of Lincoln right outside the door. And everything else on it is kind of, shows like the kind of the green verdigris corrosion or whatever the copper shows, except for the nose, which is shiny, copper colored, shiny. And the reason is, whenever you enter Lincoln's tomb, you're supposed to reach up and touch his nose for basically good luck, or as we would say, a blessing.
Yeah, that's
Right.
right.
So again, there's
That's right.
like, here's an icon of Lincoln. You touch it as you go in, then you get to see his tomb. When Lincoln died, his relics, his relics were paraded around the country on a train. That was the first time that ever been done for an American president. And so I just want to point these things out to as a kind of a way of answering the question, which is to say that when people do history, they think that what they're doing is this kind of um, really objective, third party observer, stepping outside of the stream of history, stepping outside of the story, and then trying to tell just the facts, man. Like, exactly, here's just what happened. But in actuality, nothing is like that. Even if you try to eliminate the religious or the supernatural element, the thing is that it's not a DLC. It's not like an extra module that gets bolted
Mhm.
onto
Mhm.
reality. It's
Mhm.
like, here's reality plus the supernatural. In fact, many, Orthodox theologians have suggested that these categories of like natural and supernatural are maybe where things start going wrong anyway. This is a different discussion, but
Oh, that's interesting,
I
though.
think it's
the
the
Yeah.
idea.
same discussion, actually.
Okay, yeah. So, but the point is that reality naturally takes this shape. And so when Lincoln died, we did all of these religious things, right? We weren't at that point, America, Protestant Catholic nation, lots of, and also like plenty of atheists, deists, et cetera, running around at the time. But the thing that we were kind of united around was this president, right? This person, this man who then ascended, I mean, literally the painting on the Capitol dome of the United States Capitol building is called the Apotheosis of George Washington. And it is George Washington ascending through the spheres,
Yeah, it's insane.
being greeted by the goddess Liberty and the god, et cetera, and then taking his place among the gods, right? And so all of this stuff is really natural. It's really deliberate. It's the kind of thing that kind of naturally happens. And we're in, I mean, it's weird to be talking about this stuff the day after the inauguration.
Yeah. It's good
Um,
timing on that, actually.
yeah, but anyway, so that's what I would sort of say is that historians think they're doing a different thing, and then what they try to do then is turn around and tell the story of the church, also without reference to the supernatural. And it's uh not only should you not do church history that way, but you shouldn't do, you know, secular history as though there were any such thing. You also shouldn't do it in that way.
Matthew, that just make that distinction. You're not sure there is a distinction, right?
I mean, I don't think there actually is a distinction in
I don't think
reality.
so. I don't think so either.
I don't think Richard thinks that either. I think that's, I mean, but certainly like the way we do history, and like Richard said, even the way we do church history, you could go read a book about like the history of Russian Orthodoxy, and written by a respectable historian of Russian Orthodoxy. And if they're going to mention like Saint Seraphim, it'll be in the context of like, okay, Saint Seraphim was sort of a folk religious phenomenon that's kind of notable because a lot of people went to him or whatever. It's not because Saint Seraphim was like a god and the mother of God was repeatedly showing up in 19th century Russia and talking to him. Like, if you want to talk about what actually happened, well, what actually happened is that the mother of God is a 19th century and a 20th century and a 21st century historical figure, right? In the same way that, you know, Khrushchev is a 20th century historical figure, the mother of God is, right? Like, in both of them are, in fact, in her case, she's in the body. You know, both is already resurrected. They're both doing things, having agency, affecting the course of history. But one of them we treat as kind of a historical personage, and the other one is this kind of mythical or, you know, religious sort of thing. And we make this distinction. And I just don't think that's a real distinction in actual reality. That's an artificial distinction being made by people. And it leads to all kinds of weirdness in the world because of
And
that.
Matthew just said the thing out loud. I'm always like, in the Universal History series and stuff like this, I'm always kind of tiptoeing around this stuff, because like it's too strong of a red pill for some people. Like they can't get their. But yeah, I mean that's it. That's the whole idea. And my favorite example of this would be if you take a work of medieval history like Bede's History of the English Church, or let's just take that one as an example. So there's these stories in Bede's History of the English Church. Now, just for people who don't know, secular historians take Bede as a pretty reliable witness. You know, now there might be some dithering about, well, maybe he's wrong about this, or maybe his source on this particular king's life or something like that's not totally reliable. But in general, people consider Bede to be like a pretty careful historian, you know, who's faithfully transmitting what he believes to be true, right? But the problem is that when you read Bede, he has all of this stuff in there, like, you know, when St. Augustine of Canterbury is turning away, or is thinking about turning away because things are getting hard. He's thinking about, you know, kind of calling it off and going back to Rome. St. Peter shows up in the middle of the night and, you know, flogs him, you know, and tells him, you got to get back to it. Oh, well, and in Bede, this is not, oh, well, he had some kind of a psychosomatic experience that blah, blah, blah. Right. You know, it's just St. Peter showed up in the middle of the night, appeared to him in a dream, and flogged him. And in Bede, that's taken completely at face value. Another one that I like to tell also from the life of St. Augustine of Canterbury is that as he's on his way, Bede records that, you know, he's doing miracles, he's raising the dead, et cetera, like you do, you know, just sort of, you know, bishop things. And then as he's doing all of this, he gets a letter from Pope St. Gregory the Great, who says to him, hey, listen, I've heard you've been raising the dead, working miracles, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, to make a long story short, he says, listen, this happens to a lot of people. Like, don't make a big deal about it. Don't let it get in your head. Stay focused on your mission. Don't, you know, become puffed up. You know, like, we've all raised the dead, bro. Like, you know, just like, don't become too full of yourself, you know? And all of this is in Bede, and it's all transferred in this very kind of matter-of-fact sort of a way. And but when modern historians read Bede, they'll mine him for things like where did this king live? When did he die? When did this war happen? But then they come across these supernatural elements in the story, and most of the time they don't even talk about them because they're materialists and they don't believe that sort of thing happens. If they do address it, then they have some kind of a spin on it where they'll treat it like, you know, maybe this is some kind of a propaganda thing, something like that. But if you read it in Bede, it's just very, you know, it's just very matter of fact. But all ancient sources are like this. Every single ancient source that has to deal with any historical happenings, medieval sources as well, will bring in these elements that we consider to be supernatural. But that is an artificial frame that we put over history.
Is it so my great-grandmother is sort of present in me from time to time. I remember her. I have her skin on some level all these generations later. Is she also a 21st century character in that sense then?
Not in the sense that I was just talking about, you know, because the Mother of God is showing up in the 20th century.
I see.
She is interacting with people. She is doing things very directly. as far as I know, your great grandmother isn't doing that. She may be standing before the throne of God interceding for people, but she's not, as far as I know, showing up in
Correct
the
so far.
flesh and
Yeah.
affecting the course of history directly. That's what I'm asserting about the Mother of God. I'll give an example that kind of is, Saint Catherine, the great martyr Catherine of Alexandria. Um, Early 4th century, she was martyred in Alexandria. The earliest extant account of her life is from, I believe, the 9th century. And, you know, because there's this, it's very late that we have sort of surviving evidence for her life. In the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church, I think under the influence of the Bollandists, actually removed St. Catherine from their calendar of saints because there's just not
I
enough
think
evidence.
because there will be somebody out there who's like, oh no, we didn't do. I think what they technically did is they took St. Catherine, St. Barbara, St. George, some of the other great martyrs, and they sort of demoted them to like optional local
I
Yes.
remember that.
memorials. Yeah.
I
So
remember when
St.
that happened.
Catherine, the problem I have, part of the problem I have, it's one of the many problems I have with this, is that the Bollandists, even if you accept their premises, they're ignoring evidence, right? Even if you accept the Bollandist premises, which I reject, they're ignoring evidence because St. Catherine appeared along with a whole entourage with the Mother of God in the 1830s in Russia to St. Seraphim of Sarov and a nun that was with him. And the nun had conversations with, I think Barbara was there too, with each of the women that were with with the Theotokos. And these saints all recounted their stories to her. So we have 19th century eyewitnesses to St. Catherine. So I don't need some source from the 4th century, right? Because we have 19th century sources on St. Catherine, you know? And I think that like if you presented that to a modern historian, they'd say that didn't happen, right? That's myth, that's sort of just a story. But I think that that's just an assumption that they're making
So
based on premises that they have.
So history or the understanding of it changes when large groups of, let's call them academics, simply believe the grave is final. Is that what happened?
If you begin with the premise that there is no supernatural, or that this pre-modern way of looking at reality is false, and that actually we need to be secular materialists, if you start with that premise, then of course you have to reject anything that's contrary to that premise, because that was your first principle. But
And there's definitely also, Matthew, there's a kind of implicit idea within academia in almost every field, this implicit idea that anybody who is sincere is therefore not a reliable witness.
Yeah.
Right. So
On the topic of St. George, just since you brought up St. George, my grandfather and 2 of his friends met St. George in the flesh, right? Like he appeared to them. It's a crazy story, but he would tell that story super matter-of-factly, like, oh yeah.
Really?
And the friends all had the same story, and it was just this thing that happened to them, and St. George appeared to them. So the idea that like, oh, we don't have evidence of St. George, dude, we have more evidence of St. George than we do for like my great grandfather.
Wow. Yeah. Right.
So then,
yeah.
So it's the experience of the people. It's the accepted experience of the people that allows the historians to speak differently into sort of the void, right? In other words, it's because it's accepted. For instance, if the three and I, so if you took this and let's say that I showed this podcast at like, I don't know, Columbia, where I studied history, it would all just be rebuked. It would just, thanks for playing. Is it because of that history died in the way that we're talking? So it's really a battle of culture, right? It's a battle of civilizations in some level that we're talking about. It's not about history. It's about what we accept. Is that true?
Yeah, it's about how you understand reality itself, right? The demons have convinced most people that there are no demons, right? And that their thoughts are their own thoughts and not being presented to them from external, outside parties, right? That's the deception. And one of the conclusions, one of the byproducts of that is that we would look at history and say, well, look, all of history is this very secular materialist kind of reading, but it's a byproduct of rejecting the existence of the unseen. in
Wow.
our own lives.
So I was at the restaurant and I was talking to a friend. I was talking to a friend about something very dear in my life. And at that moment, somebody very dear in my life from that story. Now they were like a very small player in that story that I was sharing, came into the restaurant. And my inclination now was to see that as a sign. But my inclination 20 years ago would not have been to see that as a sign. And is that because of essentially my baptism and my being dipped in orthodoxy that I can see? Or is it going on like, do I have to see in order for it to become more true? Can you guys feel what I'm trying to get at in terms of the epistemology of it? Like, it's always
I have a
going on
friend
then,
who's a
in other
priest.
words.
I have a friend who's a priest in California, and there is this couple that he knew, and they had a young couple with kids, and the wife had like stage 4 cancer, tried everything, no hope, she's gonna die. Family's no religious anything, no, not religious at all. And the priest says, "Hey, listen, I know this is gonna sound crazy to you, but if you're willing to try it, write a letter to St. John Maximovich in San Francisco and ask him to heal you."
Yeah.
And so she's like, "Look, I'm about to die, right? My family, my kids are going to lose their mother. I'll try anything." She writes a letter to St. John, just like because the priest told her to. Goes into gets scans done again, and the cancer's completely gone, right? And so obviously this is going to completely rock the world of this person. I don't even know what the rest of the story for this person was, but this was a couple of years ago. But what the priest told me is that the doctors said, "Look, all of our previous scans and stuff must have just been wrong. Like we must have just made a
Yes.
mistake the
They
whole
can't
time."
yeah,
And it turns out like we've checked now and like you're completely clean. Her family was like, her parents were like, "Hey, you're totally like there's nothing supernatural here. The doctors just made a mistake. So you're gonna like you have first principles, and the way you understand reality is going to be derivative of those first principles."
Hey, guys, before we get right back to the show, Gratitude Travels, run by our friends Amy and Jamie. It's a South African-based travel company that will take you anywhere in the world. Why South Africa? Well, there's a lot of good traveling in South Africa. And Amy and Jamie are South Africans. They do great trips for us. I want you to go with them. Gratitude Travels. It'll be linked in our show notes. Please do it. Go there right now, Jamie and Amy, and book your trip to wherever, including if you go to Europe, you can go to Georgia, visit our site. You can go to South Africa and go to Mozambique and visit our site in Mozambique. You want to go to Central America, they're working on that too. But they're pros. Consider your trip with Gratitude Travel. Oh, and also field workers. You want to do 2 years? Do something amazing with your life? Do something hard? We're recruiting right now for Africa and for Central America. Peace out. Back to the show.
Yeah, so I made a joke a minute ago about like trying not to red pill the normies too fast. But the reason that I say things like that is because there is, and I've definitely seen this happen. Like somebody will start to see the world in this way, and then every time any two things happen, right? They're like, "Oh, it's a sign. Oh, it's a sign. What does
Yeah.
this mean? What could this possibly mean?" I randomly opened my Bible and it was to this particular verse, and it's on, so the discernment. There's kind of the fathers talk about discernment being the highest of the gifts, but I think there's also like a kind of like a low frequency kind of, you could say, like village piety discernment, right? Not to fantasize too much about village piety. I'm sure people are sinful in villages just like they are everywhere else. But there is a kind of like a practicality when you live down to the earth, and it's like, okay, well, I got to feed the kids today, and I got to get the, plow the fields and all these different things. And when you don't have the luxury of kind of sitting in your nice isolated recording studio, just living in your head and stuff like this. But when you kind of live close to the land, um, a couple of things happen. One is that you are much more in tune, as we have to assume, ancient medieval people were. I mean, we have to assume, we know that they're much more in tune with the natural cycle of the seasons and how things happen, right? And therefore, to them, the idea that God would do something just through the normal turning of the agricultural world cycle is the most natural thing there is. To give an example of this, my personal soapbox, the way that Matthew's is St. Catherine, my personal soapbox is the date of Christmas. And I know there are people out there who like to say, oh, it's probably some date in September. Even people that I like to say that. And it's funny because when you really get down to it, it seems like most people's argument for Christmas not happening on December the 25th is very simply, well, how could you possibly know what the date is? That's too convenient. Right. So, something like that. It's something like that. And
Right.
the thing that I think that is that's bad reasoning. There's a great little book of essays on this, by the way, called The 25th by Joshua Gibbs, who's an Orthodox educator.
I know
He
Joshua.
wrote a book on it's not just about the dating of Christmas. It's just essays on a variety of Christmassy kind of subjects. But usually whenever I talk to somebody, it'll go something like, oh, well, obviously Jesus was actually born in September or October, something like this. And I'll say, well, why is that the case? Oh, well, it's because, and then they'll say something like, oh, because shepherds wouldn't be tending their fields in December or something, which is not necessarily true if you know anything about the ancient Middle East. And anyway, so you kind of go down the list of reasons, and it comes down to it at the end. And they're like, well, obviously it's just because we don't really know when it happened, and it doesn't really matter if we know anyway, et cetera, et cetera. And I really do think like the church's date is the right date, and there are a few different reasons for this. One is I think it's a little silly that the idea that God wouldn't care to tell us when he was born, and but what it really comes down to is this idea that, well, the idea that Jesus would be born in the middle of winter, the idea that the light would come into the world in the middle of winter, that's just a little too convenient. It lines up a little too nicely. And so people don't and I think it's because people want that. They want things to line up, and they want, the turning of the year, which is also part of history, right? History is cyclic, so you have the weekly cycle and the annual cycle and all those different things. When people want it to have meaning, and they feel like maybe I want this too much, and so because again, something that's sincere, something that lines up nicely, stuff like that, can't really work, right? And so
it's like a bred in cynicism.
yeah. And so, what I would say is, kind of counter to that, when else would Christ be born? When else would he be born? I mean, when else would the light come into the world except, at its darkest night, at the time of the year when every single culture says we need to have a festival of light right at this moment, right? And so, and then there's all these. So that's kind of one example. And so, one of my favorite examples of this is the idea of like Kyria Pascha, which is, I'm on the new calendar, so we don't get these. But we get a shorter Apostles Fast, so you kind of have to, you kind of have to weigh the things.
Things balance out.
But the idea of the Kyria Pascha was something the Anglo-Saxons, who were on the Julian calendar, like they knew about this and they wrote about it, and like how this is like the best, most auspicious kind of a thing that can possibly happen to your society would be for you to be alive when Easter, when Easter and the Annunciation fall on the same day, or also sometimes when Good Friday and the Annunciation fall on the same day, which can also happen.
Or Holy Saturday, which is in a few years.
Right.
So.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So there's all kinds of they were trained to see this stuff, and they were habituated to see it as though there really is meaning in the world, but also like they didn't go crazy over it, right? Because they sort of, because their assumption was there is meaning, there's always going to be meaning. Like the reason your great grandfather can tell the story about meeting St. George in this very matter of fact way is because he probably came from a time and a culture when you would sort of expect something like that to happen. Maybe it didn't happen to you, but you knew somebody it happened to, right? And so for us, once the switch gets flipped, like people go crazy for a little while. They go crazy for a little while until they can kind of get in a mode where they start to see these things. And then, when you're having a conversation about somebody and they walk in, I mean, that's absolutely something.
It's something.
I mean, it's
something.
absolutely something. I was actually in your neck of the woods, John. I was in Greenville, South Carolina, and I walked into this can I say this here? I walked into a cigar shop, okay?
Bum, bum,
And I
bum.
know. And I walked in and there are these two guys there. This happened back in June. There are these two guys there and they just like, they're sitting at the table and they just start staring at me. And finally, one of them stands up and walks over to me and says, "Are you Richard Rohlin?" I said, "Yes." I said, "We were just talking about your Ethiopia video." And these guys were
That's crazy.
freaking out. They were completely freaking out. But then, and so I sort of, I already had plans about how I was going to spend the evening, but I said, well, obviously, this is not a coincidence. I need to sit down and talk to these guys, and that's the reason I'm here, right? And so we sat down, we had a
Yes.
conversation, and
I
some some of the
love that.
and
There is a
some of them
reason
came to
there.
church with me the next day, which was
Is that
really great.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So
You still might not have been able to hang out with them, but you can't take that lightly.
right, exactly.
Yes, you're not in control. I think it's a difference between humility and a little bit of arrogance that we've acquired in the modern world, which is, yeah, of course these things are happening. Of course it's a sign, and also that doesn't mean that I'm suddenly in charge of it all. I still have to. I'm still subject. I'm still I'm the creature, but I'm seeing now clearly. But that doesn't mean I'm controlling. And so there is some balance. I like what you're saying. I kind of get
Yeah.
that. Math,
So I
Matthew,
think
do you think?
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say this. Do you think so? Richard and Jonathan, Symbolic World, do universal history. You and I were talking about sacramental history or something.
Sacred history.
Sacred history.
In a way, I don't think we're talking about different things.
No, it's the same project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew's saying, like I said, he's saying what I usually try to do is take stories that people don't take seriously and then try to show the way that those stories have meaning and it actually makes this particular people group's self-understanding, actually it makes sense, it's valid, it's coherent, right? The thing that people are always asking for is, okay, well, now do it for America, right? Or now do it for like some current, but I mostly stick to kind of the ancient civilizations and show the ways that they experienced history, especially in relation to the gospel and in relation to the Orthodox Church. The tricky thing with doing it with a recent civilization or culture, and I'm going to do it, but the difficulty is that you're going to really upset a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because okay, so America, right? We have this really complex mythology built, and I love America. I love giving grief to my friends who are not from America about how much better America is than where they live, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not a hater. I'm definitely, a little bit the other direction, if anything, like a little chauvinistic or something, right? But when you start telling the history of the 20th century, to go back to what Matthew was saying, and I'm going to hand the ball off to you here, Matthew. So you just get ready to catch it.
You know how Richard rolls, right? He'll hand it, but he might have to steal it a little bit
That's
here in a minute.
a little bit. When you tell this story of the 20th century, of course, we're like, America, like, look at all the great things that America is doing, et cetera, et cetera. But the secret history of the 20th century, right, or the sacred history of the 20th century, whatever you want to call it, involves just a whole lot of people who weren't American, right? And it's funny because growing up evangelical, you would definitely go to these things where they would try to tell, they would tell stories. And don't get me wrong, I definitely believe God and the saints have been active in American political life, or like in the story of the United States and the world wars and all those different things. Like, sure, I'm not saying God is absent, but what you don't have, typically speaking, in the story of 20th century America is the Theotokos showing up and talking to somebody, right?
Yeah.
You don't have a St. Paisios. You don't have these figures like this. And so I think that if you were to look back on the 20th century in a few hundred years, or actually, let's better say, if you were to take a heavenly perspective on the history of the 20th century and the things that have happened and the ways that God has worked, you'd have to say, actually, all of the most important things and the most important people, well, most of them didn't live in America.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair.
And
I
that's a
think that
really hard pill for
so
Americans
if we
to swallow.
start with the premise, which I obviously do, that that the Orthodox Church, we are the people of God. We are the body of Christ, and we are the people of God. Then that is the focal point for human history. Even if numerically it's small and from a worldly perspective it's weak, right? In the same way that ancient Israel, from our perspective, we would say ancient Israel is the focal point for the ancient world. Even if, yeah, you can go back and say, but they were like this dinky little kingdom and they weren't that big of a deal and whatever. Like, okay, but that's only from one vantage point,
Right. Archaeologically, the most important king in terms of ancient Israel, like in terms of stuff that has survived from him, is Omri, who's Ahab's father. Omri gets like 2 lines in the Old Testament. It basically says this guy was a jerk and then he died.
And he bought a hill.
And he bought a hill. He was a jerk and then he died. And then you got all the stuff about Ahab and Elijah. Well, why Ahab and Elijah? Because Elijah is actually the most important person from that era.
Yeah.
Right. And it's his story is the real story. Right. Because he's part of the people of God. And because obviously because he's a saint.
Yeah, and so we can even do this, like people even do this with church history. So you'll look at Mount Athos and they'll say like, look, there was this period of deep decline in the 20th century because numerically Mount Athos collapses in the 20th century. There's just a fraction of the number of monks that there were at the beginning of the 20th century. And buildings are in disrepair, everything's kind of a mess. And yet this is like when you have a whole bunch of wonder-working saints on Mount Athos, right? So was it a golden age for Mount Athos? Or was it a period of decline for Mount Athos? And the answer is kind of both, right? It kind of is both. Another, like, I'll say something really provocative and offensive.
Go for it.
I believe that the reason that the Orthodox Church caused the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that the Orthodox Church caused the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason I think this is because if we look at reality holistically, and we see that all of these things are connected, right? If you were an ancient person and there was a plague, you would say, what sin caused the plague, right? What happened what did we do that like, who sinned that this happened, right? And maybe not, maybe it wasn't someone's sin, but that's the first place to look is like in repentance, right? So
certainly
right
the first place people look in the Bible, like, yeah.
In the Bible, yeah, there's something terrible happens, and then a plague breaks out, and then what happens? The priests have to intercede, and incense, and there whatever it is, right?
Standard ancient world, yes, move.
So why is that different? If we're Christians, why on earth would we think that something has changed?
Because it makes you feel bad. Because you're actually trying to identify the real problem.
That what happened right before COVID happened that effectively excommunicated most of the Orthodox Church for a period of time, right? What happened? Well, there was a great schism in the Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to talk about like church politics. I'm just saying there was a schism in the Orthodox Church, and then there was a global pandemic that shut down human activity and excommunicated the faithful. That seems like that's not a coincidence. And if we look at the world from a kind of a holistic way, we would have to say that's the proximate cause. Maybe that's not the how COVID happened, but that is the why COVID happened. And unfortunately, I don't think we have taken that lesson. And
we being those who are within the church, we should be reasoning that way.
Yes. Yeah, we should see that the church, just like Israel itself was the priest of the world, right? The priest for the nations, right? The Orthodox Church is the priest for the nations, right? And are we fulfilling our priestly function? Are our leaders functioning as in a healthy manner as priests? If that fails, we should expect there to be tumults and problems and catastrophes.
And so sacred history is sort of plotting the pain and the sin within the church, within the practitioners of Orthodoxy, and then sort of understanding everything that happens in the world from that causal point. That would be a sacred history, is understanding the world.
That would be an aspect of reading things through a sacred history lens, I believe.
which is how hagiography reads. Whenever you read about how the saints are understanding things, they do start with sin, and it sort of ebbs out from there, and that is true. Gosh, that's hard for me to.
It's a rough pill to swallow, and
It is.
but I mean, it's forget, people can argue all they want to about, is Orthodoxy the true church, et cetera, but like just even if you just forget all of that, and you say, how are we going to approach the history in the Holy Scriptures? Right? Is what's actually the most, now obviously Christianity is important because it's big, right? And this is man, I avoided an argument with somebody on social media this week, so you should all be proud of me.
Well
Who
done.
wanted to basically say, like, listen, Orthodoxy, okay, so there've been a lot of people, I guess, finally noticing that something is happening, and so there's just been a lot of kind of flack directed our way, which is, everybody should be cool and mature about it because it's actually a good thing. But anyway, so it just said something like, well, American Christianity is never going to look like this, and American, Orthodoxy is so small, and so it'll never be big or relevant. And they use those things like it'll never matter. That's what they said. It'll never matter in America. And the implicit assumption there, first of all, is that things are only important if they're big. But if you think about the situation of the church in, the book of Acts, we're really talking about, like less than 1% of the Roman Empire, right? And what continues to be an extremely small percentage until
great
about
point,
the late
Richard.
4th or early 5th century, a very
great
small
point.
percentage of the Roman Empire. Obviously, it seems important to us now because we know what happens with Constantine, and we know what happens with Theodosius, and we know what happens with the spread of Christianity and the conversion of the empire. But I mean, at the time, this is a very small, it's even smaller than, Bronze Age Israel, right? But if we go back to Israel in the Bronze and the Iron Age, if we look at the histories of the Old Testament, I mean, what Matthew said is exactly right. And so the question is, what are you going to do with the history in the Scriptures, right? How do you read this?
Yeah.
Because we know there's tons of other more important things happening in terms of, big countries doing big things and big wars happening. And, we know that during the Bronze Age, there was some kind of a world war between the Hittites and the Egyptians, and maybe the Israel got, caught in the middle of it. And there are like two small references, to that in the whole Old Testament, right? Because it actually wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was whether or not the people of God would remain faithful to God or not.
Yeah.
And so I mean, you can, even if like you can't swallow that pill for the 20th century, I think there's a lot of basis to what Matthew is saying just in reading the Scriptures and just asking the question, how seriously am I going to take them? And I know there are people out there who don't think you should take the Scriptures seriously at all as history. But the reason they think that is because they are proceeding with these materialist presets.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. But it does ask a lot of, well, I would say this. It should be a hard, would you call it a black pill? It is, or a red pill. But here's what I want to say.
I can't keep up with the colors.
I
now
can't keep
assigned
up
to
with the
pills.
colors either.
It's too much.
Here's what I want to say. I think understanding the LA fires as somehow related to that which takes place in the sacred space, which is the church. I think I get it. I think that's the proper disposition. But I think when I get into trying to figure out the how, like, okay, was it St. John?
Well, I don't think I think that's dangerous to do
Yes,
too much.
I
of
think
that. I mean,
that's
with
dangerous.
COVID, I feel like it's so crystal clear, blindingly obvious that I can say it out loud, even if it might be appalling to people. Because as an Orthodox Christian, I'm like, okay, giant schism, plague. I mean, I don't know, man. Let's get a straight line. But with other things, it's not that we can just draw these straight lines. I don't think that's appropriate, right? Because there's just sin in the world, and sin causes suffering, and those kinds of things are not necessarily clear cut how that all relates to each other.
And historically, in our tradition, in our church, the people who can see the pattern are prophets.
Yeah.
They're holy men, right? And they can actually see the connection between these different things. And it's not, by the way, saying that connection is the only connection between those things. Like God can be, a plague that's judgment for one people can also have other purposes that are going on. Same thing with fire, same things with lots of different things. I mean, who are we to put constraints on God? But the point is that I think the point would be that if you're not one of those special people who's been given that gift of discernment,
This is it.
then what you need to focus on is not, hey, who can I blame for this? But rather, how has my sin contributed to this?
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
And
Yeah, that's
even with the COVID example, I think
Yeah,
I think that's the case, right? Because I'm seeing this as look, I do church history, right? And obviously this is present day, so it's a little hard to do that with current events. But in 100 years, the version of me, the me in 100 years is going to look back and make that connection, right? But that doesn't mean that in the present, it's like, well, what have I done? I've somehow been excommunicated? Like, I've done something, right? I've sinned. I need to do something about that.
Yeah. Which does seem like a proper response, given all the other sacred, lessons I've learned as an Orthodox for 30 years. It always sort of does start with my repentance and my awareness of my own sin. I think that's why I was not enjoying the way you were describing it, Matthew, because the way you're describing it made me feel like I needed to know. For instance, I have a certain brother who's a priest and he makes connections, and I think he made the same connection you did. And he was using the saints of the 20th century. And the way you described it right now is the way he described it. And I would always, these are like just phone calls between he and I would want to shed it because it felt like he knew something or was very, 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 very strongly opinionated about something that still didn't connect for me. But I don't think you can dismiss it, whether you're just a priest like himself or whether he's reading the saints or you're reading the saints. I do believe it's connected. I'm not sure I know how, and I don't want to wade in
I don't
where I
think the
don't know how.
mechanisms are for us to understand. I think we can observe the patterns,
Right.
and the history provides us with a lot of examples of patterns. That doesn't mean that we can then get in there and figure out how the mechanisms all work, because I don't think it's all mechanistic.
Yeah,
I
you
don't.
could say that a big part of the materialistic approach to history actually is saying the mechanism is the most important thing. So I give you a good example of this. You could say, I mean, so the driving. So I did my undergrad in history and economics. Two great tastes that go great together, said Karl Marx. So the
I did it too.
the
Same.
driving way of understanding and talking about history for the last 150 years,
This is the problem. Yeah.
maybe 200 years now, has been thinking about it in terms of economics and thinking about it in terms of the distribution of power. And that's the only way that most people are capable of thinking about it. Christians fall into this trap all the time. People doing church history fall into this trap all the time. And so they'll say, all right, they're writing up like a history of, for instance, let's pick something non-controversial, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, right? Where they'll say, oh, well, it was really just like these political things and these economic factors, all these different things. And that's why they were talking past each other. And so the stuff that was, the church decided at Chalcedon doesn't actually matter. We should kind of like sweep that under the rug and kind of move on from it. Just
I've
as
heard
an
that.
example. Matthew knows the sort of argument that I'm talking about. So the problem with this is that it's like assuming that because you can say, well, here's the material cause, right? Here's the material cause of some miracle that happens, right? The cancer goes away. It was like, oh, well, your body just fought it off really fast, or the treatment was extra effective, or like whatever. And so we won't say something was a miracle, and we won't say God intervened in some way until we can absolutely say, look, there's no material cause whatsoever for this thing that happened. And there is stuff like that, but that is not really how things have ever worked. And so, but you can think of things like economics and military movements and things like that as being sort of the material causes of things that happen in history. But the point of what I think Matthew was trying to argue for is that that's actually not the real story. And you can say, yeah, okay, there were material causes, economic forces, military power, etc. But if you fixate on those things, then you're gonna miss what the real story is. And
Is it?
so you could say, yeah, there was this lab, they were doing gain of function research, like whatever you believe about COVID and all this stuff. Like you could say, that's why it happened. So it didn't have anything to do with my sins. It had to do with, Fauci's sins or Fauci, I don't know how to say his name, had to do with his sins, or
Fauci.
it was the Democrats, or it was the elites, or it was the right. And so actually using the putting a kind of focus on the material cause is a way of, among other things, shifting things away from the uncomfortable discussion, which is
Yeah.
actually, how should I be living my life right now? How should I be living out my repentance? Which is actually always the focus of these things.
You remind me of the same mistake I think moderns have made with anthropology. Anthros, what is a human being? They just skip this part of us called nous or spirit, and so we're animals, and that's not the whole story. It's not the whole story. Huh. Guys,
There tends
Trump
to be
didn't
a
put
lot
his
of focus on the how things happen, and the how gets mistaken for the why.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think that's one of the big problems in many respects, but in history, because we're talking about history, I think that's one of the big problems in history. One quick story. I have a priest friend who was a priest in Hawaii when a few years ago there was a big hurricane that was heading toward one of the islands, and it was going to be devastating. And so everybody's panicking. It's coming, right? Brace yourselves. So he and his people go into the church. Is the church that has the wonder-working icon, the Averon icon of the Mother of God. So they went into the church and they start praying like a Mulyebin, I think, to the Mother of God. And as soon as the Mulyebin ends, the hurricane disappears, just disappears. And so you can watch on radar, like I could send it to you, right? We could show it, you could put it on the screen, that you can watch the hurricane on the radar kind of just go away at this one point. And I asked the priest, I was like, what time, how long was the service? Like, what time was he? He was like, oh, it started here, ended about here. Right when the service ended is when the hurricane went away. Right now, on the meteorologists are like, this was amazing. There's just this unexpected like wind shear thing that happened, and they can explain meteorologically, like, oh yeah, this is a thing that can happen, and it did happen, and this was great. It was a good outcome, right? So that tells you how the Mother of God stopped the hurricane, right?
That's right.
But the Mother of God stopped the hurricane.
And even more proximate example, there was that massive tropical storm that was headed to Florida. And it was supposed to hit Tarpon Springs. In fact, we had people visiting our parish who had basically just relocated from Tarpon Springs, rather than try to wait the storm out. This happened earlier this fall, I think. I can't remember the name of the tropical storm now, but and then the Orthodox Christians in Tarpon Springs, Florida, they took relics of St. Nicholas and an icon of St. Nicholas out, and they blessed the shoreline. And then literally 30 minutes later, the storm was just gone. It just blew over, and they were expecting it's going to be, really catastrophic, all of this stuff, and then the storm just dissipated. And it's very, very clear to somebody in the ancient world, St. Nicholas stopped the storm, as he, by the way, is well known to do.
Yeah.
And he has a reputation for doing these sort of things, and we asked him, and he did it, and glory to God. Right. And so that's very simple. And yeah, again, you could say, oh, well, we were wrong about what we thought the hurricane was going to do, or we were, or there were these other meteorological forces we didn't take into account when we were estimating, all these different ways to explain how St. Nicholas stopped the storm. But the thing that you should see is, glory to God. Through the intercessions of St. Nicholas, we've been delivered from this terrible catastrophe. So what should we do? Well, listen, you've been given another day to repent. You've been given a little more time to get your life in order. You should, maybe start actually asking the saints for help and intercession more often, because they really do listen.
That's
what you take away from that.
Exactly.
That's right. That's the control part, because as a modern, I want control over me. I'm talking about me, John. I want control over something, but the control is in the prayer. I mean, I can go right now. I could get off this call. I could go sit in front of my icons and I could pray. That's what I have control over. God, I don't need all the hows. That's very interesting, Richard. There's so many stories, and you guys have a lot of those stories. You can share more, but I got a quick question. Trump did not put his hand on a Bible. That's hot on the internet right now.
I didn't actually see that. I did watch the inauguration, but I guess the camera, the angle of the broadcast I was watching, I've watched every inauguration that I've been alive for, as far as I know. Like I am really interested in these things, but I didn't see that he didn't touch the Bible. I saw that there was like some kind of like a rush or something, and like they couldn't get the Bible up there in time when they started.
Yeah, it's a big Twitter blow up or whatever, I
Yeah.
guess, because now what does that mean? It's very
Is
interesting.
he really even president? Well, I mean, so this is it's
not nothing.
so it's an interesting opportunity to talk to people about why we swear oaths on Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so in the Middle Ages, you could take an oath on one of two things. That is, with your hand on one of two things. So very often when kings would swear oaths, whether it was, at their coronation or to make some kind of a treaty, there's a famous story where, Edward, the Confessor, and William the Bastard, William the Conqueror, as he was later known. It's one of the perks of conquering a country is you can change your nickname. But
I did
sorry,
not
and,
know
and
that.
then
William
Harold,
Conqueror
right?
and
That they,
William the Bastard is the same person.
yes, yeah, William he
did not
was
know
an
that.
illegitimate son. Like bastard is a technical
Makes
term in
sense.
this
Yeah,
case.
yeah.
So he's called William the Bastard, William of Normandy, and then eventually he, conquered England and became known as William the Conqueror. But anyway, the whole reason there's a question of succession, between William and Harold Godwinson is because of this oath that Harold is supposed to have taken on some relics of a saint when he was washed up on the coast of Normandy. And so anyway, it's not important. The point is that when people swore oaths in the Middle Ages, they would do it on one of two things. They would either put their hands on the relics of a saint, or they would put their hands on the gospel book, right? Because, typically speaking, you didn't have a Bible all in, one volume that comes a lot later.
Right.
But that's the origin of this, of the idea of oath taking. And in fact, people forget, but oath taking is one of the things that the radical reformers tried to do away with. And so, for instance, Quakers, early Methodists, etc., one of the things, and a lot of Puritans, especially the more strict ones, one of the things that they tried to get rid of was all oaths whatsoever. And people sometimes think this means like swearing or something, but it really means any kind of a formal oath. Because if you take a formal oath with your hand on a holy object, you are saying there is a holy object, and I'm going to bind myself to it. And that object is going to become a medium of God's grace if I keep the oath, and it's going to become a medium of God's judgment if I don't keep the oath. That is what you say when you put your hand on something and swear an oath. And eventually, and so this is one of those weird things, because there were religious sects in England, for instance, in the going all the way. I don't know if anybody has ever seen, you guys have seen Master and Commander.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, there's uh, uh, one of the things that comes up in the books, if you read the Aubrey Maturin series, is this question of oaths, because there are certain characters who belong to very anti-high church, very anti-sacramental religious sects, and therefore they refuse to swear oaths when they would, like enter, so that, entering the Royal Navy, something like that. And so anyway, but there were these religious sects in England and in the early days of the United States who would not swear oaths, which would mean, by the way, that certain things they couldn't do, like they couldn't hold political office, couldn't be in the military, stuff like this.
Well, you'll find it interesting, Richard. A lot of the comments, I was just reading this somehow. I don't even know how it came to me, but a lot of the comments were of that ilk, which was, he doesn't need to do that anyway because you shouldn't be swearing an oath. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter what he says. It just matters what he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always think, I kind of got into this thing yesterday, unfortunately, on Twitter. Like all Twitter posts, it should have just been kept to myself. But I kind of got into this thing about spontaneity in prayer, and whether or not a prayer should be, especially a public prayer that you're doing in a public place, to commemorate a solemn occasion, whether or not that should be something that is spontaneous. There's a great book called Rituals of Spontaneity by my friend Dr. Lori Branch, which is actually examines this idea that arises at the beginning of the Enlightenment, and it starts in England with the whole prayer book controversy. But basically, it's the idea that most people take for granted now that the more spontaneous something is, the more sincere it is. But actually, if you think about it, that's dumb. Like, if you just think about it, like, on its face, that's very dumb. Like, the idea that the less that I think about something, the more sincere it is. Like, no. Like, if something is really important to me, I'm gonna spend, and by the way, I don't think anybody's prayers at the inauguration were totally spontaneous. Like, obviously, the guy was really thinking about what am I gonna do and what am I gonna say, and it kind of becomes, when you're on television, it becomes kind of this performance art. This is a different conversation. But just the idea that the less that I think about something, the more off the cuff it is, the more I care about it. Like, try applying that to your marriage. Try applying that to, like, a test at school. Like, it should be like, because this is the most important test I'm going to take. I'm taking the SATs, so I'm going to do zero prep because it's so important. Like, it's just, it would be nonsense to apply this to anything. But the funny thing is that we really know, like, deep down, we have this intuition that it's not true. Because when it comes to a wedding, although weddings have gotten so
I
much
might
worse.
fight you on this a little bit, but go ahead.
Okay,
finish this.
let's go.
All right. Well, there's a Georgian phrase that says, when it's time to toast or to pray, don't let it go from your heart to your head. Allow it to travel directly to your mouth, because the vulnerability of not having practiced it will allow for it to be more true. And so that's not, it's not a zero in my mind.
Although I would say, even for something like that, in a context of Georgia, for example, right? You have been around Orthodox prayers your entire life. When I,
it's
as a
curated.
cradle Orthodox
Mhm.
Christian, am in a situation where I need to spontaneously pray, it is going to sound like a prayer I read out of a prayer book, because I'm going to use all the turns of phrase and all of the form, and everything is going to look. If you guys, from an outside perspective, you might be like, did he memorize an Orthodox prayer? Right. So I think in a culture like Georgia that's steeped in Orthodoxy, that may be a different context. But if you don't have that rootedness, where whatever spontaneously comes out of your mouth is going to sound like an Orthodox prayer, like in Georgia, then it becomes what's in there that's going to come out, right?
But also a toast is not church. It's not, and it's not an oath of office. Like, a toast is an inherently less formal setting, right? And so I'm now there. Obviously, I've done a few supras with you. Obviously, there is a formality, like, to the supra.
There's a structure,
right? But it's kind of loose. It's kind of loose. And part of the reason, and you've never told me this, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, John, but I've sort of intuited this from the ones that I've been to. And you always tell this anecdote, but you only ever tell it once somebody has gone way too long with their toast. I've done this with you several times now. And every time you tell it, it's because somebody got up and they went way too long with their toast. And then you're like, listen, this needs to be a little more from the heart. What are you saying? Well, you're really saying, like, stop sitting there and thinking about, okay, how am I going to impress people with the thing that I'm going to say? Because there's always the one guy at the supra who's like, all right, I got this thing locked and loaded. I knew I was coming to this. I've been working on my toast for 3 days. I've got it chambered, right? But that impulse on his part is because he's making his toast into something more important than it is, right? Because there's an idea, again, if something is important to me, if a lot hinges on this moment, then it's got to be certain words. And so that's the thing. It's not even so much the idea of it's got to be long or prepared. It's the idea that there are certain words which are only appropriate for certain times. And so with the supra, this applies as well. There are certain words that you have to use as keys to open up certain parts of the supra. Like, you've got to use, like, if I want to give a toast, there's a certain word I need to say. If you want to give me the toast, if you want to let me be Tomadoff for a little bit, there are certain words that you say to kind of pass that over to me. And the fact that we use those words instead of just saying, hey, John, can I give a toast?
Right.
If I went to your thing and I said, hey, John, can I give a toast?
No,
that would be super disrespectful
Yep.
of the whole project that we're doing. Right.
Correct.
And so that's kind of what I mean is this idea that there are certain phrases, there are certain words you have to use. And so when we hit the most important moments, then there's a sort of repeat after me that has to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see.
And that is part of what having your hand on the Bible means, because here's actually the most kind of important moment. And so what we all know is Trump shouldn't just get up and say, "Hey guys," I'm not going to do a Trump impression. Trump shouldn't just get up and say, "Hey guys, I'm going to be a really great president. I'm going to be the greatest president ever." Like, there should be a repeat after me where the justice says, "Say these words," and you say them, and you have your hand on something that everybody at least agrees should be holy, and that we kind of collectively should hold as sacred. And the fact that there's fewer and fewer things that we have in common, even as Christians, fewer and fewer things that we are able to hold sacred together, is a symptom of the world coming apart. I talked a bunch.
No,
but
Matthew,
I
we're getting toward
think
the
that
twilight here. Go ahead, Matthew.
yeah, I just think there's a strong case to be made for formality, and I think even in the supra, that's there, and it can be really short phrases. Like, again, just the little phrases that you use as keys to kind of unlock.
Sagrazello. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're making a great. What I'm trying to get away from is the curation of the idea into something like a speech. And you're right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's still necessary in some settings. In some settings, you have to do it.
But also, we don't want an oath of office to be a speech. And the problem with a lot of the prayers at the inauguration is that they were also speeches.
Yeah.
So, like, everybody has like their, like, I mean, part of the problem around this is that there's literally no such thing as an extemporaneous prayer. Because everybody has prayers in mind, prayers that they've heard people, and if you don't have something to read from, you just fall into the patterns of speech that you're familiar with. In the tradition I grew up in, that sounds like, "Dear Heavenly Father, dear Lord, we are truly thankful, dear Lord,
That's a
for all
great
of the
point,
abundance
Richard.
that you have."
Right. They
That's
sound
not
the same. You're right.
That's not an extemporaneous prayer. You're
That's
just
right.
you're just
That's
saying
right.
the same prayer that you always say for dinner. There is nothing wrong with that, but maybe there are better prayers to say for dinner.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right.
And so in that sense, I totally agree with you, but I think actually what you're saying is an example of the importance of formality, right? The importance of because one of the things that it does is it sort of binds you down to a certain brevity, right? So that you're putting less and less of your ego into the thing, and you just kind of say the words. And that was actually, even for me, like doing the supra, I definitely had that moment. It took me like 2 or 3 supras to have that moment where I was like, actually, you know what? It would just be okay to say to my children, they're wonderful.
Matthew, you haven't gone, but we're inviting you now.
Yeah, we're gonna do it.
Come to the restaurant.
We'll do it.
I would love to.
Matthew, give us your take real quick on how maybe the sacred history concept, and because we're in the twilight of our conversation right now. Because
No, we're gonna go
way
like 6
over.
more
My
hours,
editor's
John.
going to yell at me.
We're gonna go for
Yes.
hours.
I know we can. I love it, but I'm told
I
not
bumped
to.
my next thing, so we're good.
Matthew, like, do it for us maybe a little bit about the American moment, history, Trump, and then maybe how you see it connected in some ways, if you do it all, to sacred history. Is that?
I mean, I've
is that
talked about
possible?
the present a lot, but I actually think that's like dangerous. Like I said something about COVID. I talk about like meteorological events. I think there's a danger there because we don't have perspective. I think that there is a frame within which we should be understanding reality. That frame of understanding reality applies, as I see it, to all of reality, right? To my personal life, to my like daily life, to the way I look at history, to the way I look at current events, right? Like everything should be viewed within this same kind of framework of understanding, which is that there are spiritual powers that are interacting with our sort of physical, what we can see. There's an unseen that is just as real as the seen. And we sort of ignore that to our peril. And if we ignore it when we're talking about history, we will miss the right way of understanding history. So if you look at ancient Israel from a purely secular materialist historical perspective, you would say there's nothing really that big of a deal. It's not important. Why are we paying so much attention to these people? Right? But that's because you've basically like missed most of the story, right? Most of what's actually going on because you're focusing just on some bare physical sort of realities. And so when we look at history, I think it's important to see the hand of God in history. We can't necessarily, like we talked about, like understand the mechanisms exactly, right? But to understand, it's that you see the hand of God, but you also see the influence of the demonic. And you also
Yeah.
see, so
Yeah.
to understand, for example, I've referred to the period around World War I, end of World War I, Bolshevik Revolution, Greco-Turkish War, early 1920s, chaos, right? I would say that was an end of the world. The world ended ended after World War I, in that kind of the
Yeah,
years
for
after World War
sure.
I,
For
right?
sure.
There was that you can look and understand that from a purely secular way, from a secular historical perspectives. And the Orthodox Church is going to seem like a side character, right? And you're going to have all kinds of economic explanations and these kinds of things. But I think if we're looking at things from in a holistic way, we would see there are spiritual forces at play. And those spiritual forces are at play all the way up to the present, right? And it starts to create weird cognitive dissonances when you start to look at the world in this way. So there's this point in the 1950s where a literal God testified before a Senate subcommittee hearing, which was St. John Maximovich. He shows up in Washington, D.C., and he testifies before this subcommittee. And like, I look at it like, say, okay, I know people who knew St. John. I've like talked to people who knew St. John. St. John was a little G God, right? St. John could walk through walls. He could bend space-time. I have firsthand accounts of St. John bending space-time, right? He could do all these amazing things. And he's also like showing up and like dealing with senators and lobbying the government and like giving testimony and like,
pouring
you know,
soup on his head.
it's the same person, right? And at that moment, when like this is something some of you guys were alluding to earlier, like at that moment in whatever 1952 or whatever, he's the most powerful person in the United States. In when he was there in Washington D.C., he is the most powerful man in America at that
You're
point.
wrinkle a lot of people's brains with this.
Good stuff, though.
Yeah.
So that
because
changes
it's in alignment.
your
It's
whole
in alignment.
perspective, right? But it's what I want to emphasize is it's not this parallel story that's running parallel to the kind of the straight history. It's all together, right? It's all smushed together. You can't pull them apart. It's artificial to pull them apart. When you put them all together, yeah, it breaks your brain a little bit. It hurts. It's hard to understand, but it's reality, right? So you had like Saint Porphyrios and Saint Jacobus of Evia and Saint Paisios, okay, as young men in the same 1950s period, you had two gods in the Greek army fighting against the communists in the Greek Civil War, right? They had two gods in their army. Okay, that's a weird thing to say.
People
right?
are flinching every time you say God, Matthew.
Oh, you know,
Aren't
you better
they,
take
Richard?
opening here, Richard.
People
Yeah.
right now, the comments are filling up. Just not yet.
It is technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. I mean, it's yeah, but people are definitely gonna like this is gonna be difficult for some people to
Let me read something from St. Maximus the Confessor. St. Maximus the Confessor said, "We are made gods and sons of God, and the body and limbs and the members of God." Right? There are all the sayings of the church fathers that talk about us becoming gods by grace, not capital G God, but still, right? And I think it's
All the
important
time.
to make people a little squirm a little bit, right? When we talk about the saints, especially these wonder-working saints, it's just like, no, actually, like there's a reason why Saint Paul and Barnabas, remember, they got mistaken.
Right.
Zeus and
Jupiter,
Hermes
Mercury, yeah.
in Jupiter and Mercury, and so they're like, because they're like doing God things, right? They're doing the only kind of people that do this are gods, right?
I always like the assumption that because Paul is talking the most, he must be the less important of the two. That's my favorite thing in the book of Acts.
That is awesome.
It's so great. It's such an old world assumption. It's like this guy is talking the most. He must not be in charge. Right?
Therefore, he's the pauper.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is important to shock people. I mean, I don't know if I've ever told you guys what I always tell new catechumens. I'm the catechist at St. Seraphim Cathedral here in Dallas. And what I always tell new catechumens is, all right, so the basis of this religion is that we eat God to become God. And that's the only thing you're here for. And everything else is secondary to that goal. And you should be weirded out by that.
That's a great thing you tell them. It's a great thing. I've heard you say it.
If you don't get weirded out, then what you're going to think is that orthodoxy is just, that the Orthodox Christian faith is just one other religion among a bunch of different options. And what you're going to think is that, maybe it's just like downloadable content that I can add on to whatever tradition I came from, and just sort of be like, let me take, this upbringing and add icons to it, and boom, there we go. I'm Orthodox. And it really needs to be actually shocking and offend your sensibilities a little bit, because it's a crazy thing. And people in the ancient world got offended all the time. Like the whole reason there was a Council of Nicaea is because the idea that God would have become flesh,
it was a big problem.
Was a big problem for these people. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that, that the movie we're working on, Christianity's, sort of the controlling image, the controlling idea. We got a blessing to go in a couple of months to go film. I think it's Simona Petra. They have the hand of St. John the Baptist. It's the fleshy relic of St. John.
Is it Chrysostom's hand or
no?
St. John the Baptist.
St. John the Baptist.
Okay.
And they bring it out to bless the water. I think it's every month. There's a vigil, but they don't allow filming. But I think we have a blessing. We're working on it. But I tell folks who I want in the movie, non-Orthodox, that sort of the controlling image is the priest holds the hand that baptized the Creator, the King of all, and we're going to say that there's something like a ripple that starts there and goes out. And so what's a Christian? I don't know. There's all these ripples. Let's figure it out. But there's a center. There's got to be a center. So the controlling image of the film is that there it is. You talk about offended. People are like, first of all, what's the hand? What's that about? And the second one is, so you're saying that there is like a center? And I'm like, yeah, well, of course. Aren't you saying that? You're a Christian. And you realize that's not a good starting point. They get irritated with this starting point. It's fascinating. I don't know what that means. I mean, we're not trying to offend anybody, but it's a pretty cool controlling image in trying to figure out how Christianity is known in the world.
Yeah.
Yikes.
I think when you take all this stuff away, you certainly get the situation where Christianity and converts to Orthodoxy, people that start YouTube channels talking about Orthodoxy, struggle with this all the time, with this idea that it's just a series of things that I need to believe.
Yeah, there you go.
So if I think these things and I change to these other things that I'm thinking, then I'm Orthodox. Or, I couldn't possibly be Orthodox unless I can think all of these different things. And of course, obviously, like, there will be a real change of mind, like a real repentance that hopefully happens as part of your life of Orthodox Christian. But it's really about, but it really starts with actually the stuff that you do with your body. And that's why my first catechetical lesson is always, here's how we walk into the church.
That's when I've taught catechism, that's how I start.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Here's how we walk into the church. We're going to make some bows, and then we're going to come inside, and here's how we venerate the icons, and here's kind of the order that you go in. Because now you're walking, it's your family. And so who do you say hello to first? Well, obviously Christ. And then who do you say hello to next? Well, obviously his mother. And then you kind of go down the line from there.
It's great.
And just teaching people, which for that's how, I grew up in a family that was really heavily influenced by Chinese culture, which is still kind of old world in a lot of respects, or used to be. And that's how, if you walk into the room, this is also just Southern manners too. If you walk into the room, who do you say hi to first? Well, your grandmother. If I walk into the room and I say hi to my brother first before I go over and I greet my grandmother, then it's offensive, right?
You know, one of my favorite thresholds for new sort of ortho bros or whoever. I love. Do you burn incense when you pray? Because try doing that around now. Just new. That's like,
oh yeah, sure.
What, am I a Hindu? Hold on, what am I doing?
Yeah.
But that's a really important one. The image, first of all, the iconography of it, but also the actual, your house changes.
Yeah.
And I love that one as a threshold.
Smells like prayer.
Yeah. All right, this came to mind, and then we can finish. But so the way you're describing, Matthew, this thing, sacred history, and it really universal history, the same conversation. So here's the thing just came to mind. Samuel Huntington, you guys, he's a historian. It's sort of, without going deep into it, he sort of said, well, basically there's like 8 cultures. I think it's 8. I'm not sure if it's 8 or 7, but there's sort of cultural centers, and that they're reforming. He's writing this in the 90s. They're reforming, and each, he doesn't use these words, but I'm gonna, each has its own sort of sacred history. Or it each has its own narrative for understanding itself, because that's what history is. It's a way to understand who I am. That's the way it should be taught. So are we saying that, yes, it appears that way, but there's really just one? And thanks for playing. And there may be wars because of these sacred histories, but there's one in the end that will be revealed. Do I have that right?
I mean, that's the audacity of the Christian claim, isn't it? That it's a universal claim that was made about Christ, that excluded other gods, that demanded everything, right?
Yeah, the thing to understand is that this is
helpful.
exactly the point of the Apocalypse of St. John. So, or the book of Revelation, right? What is the revelation of? Well, of Jesus Christ, but it's of Jesus Christ and his hand in history. And so there are different ways to the funny thing is, like, everybody knows Revelation is about the future, and they really tend to fixate on like the future part of it. But actually Revelation is just about history, and it applies to every single period in history. The book of Revelation applies. Like, and so that's why there's these arguments, like in the Protestant world, like, is Revelation about Nero? Is Nero the Antichrist? Yes. But also, like, is there an Antichrist coming? Also, yes. Like, there have been.
The Lamb was also Antichrist.
Right, exactly. And so there's the best way that I've ever heard it described, and this isn't a book by a oh boy, what's his name? Stratford Caldecott, of all people, who's a great Roman Catholic classical educator. He died a few years ago now, but he wrote a book on the book of Revelation, and he sort of took in kind of these ancient readings of it and explained, like, in his way of thinking, and I think this is right, and I think this is orthodox, that the book of Revelation is history as understood through the liturgy. And so it's very, very clear, like, if you just know the liturgy well, okay, this part really corresponds to this part of the liturgy. I mean, there's a moment in the book of Revelation, and it is not obvious to modern people because a chapter break was inserted, which is, I'm always suspicious of the chapter breaks, because it's a nice way for somebody to sneak in something and say, all right, this thing doesn't have anything to do with this next thing. So, like, make a little break in your mind. Okay, so there's a chapter break, but if you take the chapter break out, here's what happens in Revelation. I think it's 10 to 11. The tabernacle, the holy place of the heavenly tabernacle, right? The heavenly temple where God is forever enthroned and worshipped. The most holy place opens. The sanctuary opens, and you see the Ark of the Covenant. But then the Ark of the Covenant is a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. And if you take the chapter break out, those things just flow immediately into each other. And so it's very, from an Orthodox perspective, it's very obvious. You're reading Revelation, here's the Ark, but the Ark is the Mother of God, but also the church being revealed kind of as the secret that's being hidden, in history, constantly pursued by the dragon, and the pursuit of the dragon, trying to kill her and her offspring, and then her offspring, who is Christ, crushes the head of the dragon. That's the whole story of history. And that's always been the case. And the woman is Israel, and she's the Theotokos, because of course the Theotokos is just all of faithful Israel, right? All that's left of it, all that's been gathered into herself. The woman is the church, which is also, what the Theotokos, like, it's happening at all these different levels, and that's always been the case. That's always been the case. It's always the story of history, and it's going to continue to be the story until the New Jerusalem, which is also the Theotokos, descends upon creation, and heaven and earth are united, right? And so that's the whole story of history that's being revealed. And so that's what St. John is doing in his revelation. And it's important to understand this because, of course, he's writing to people who are currently being persecuted, and Nero is happening, and all of these other things are happening, and it's a really bad time. Just listen to the letters of the 7 churches, except for, who is it? Is it just which church is it that gets off? But like pretty much everybody, it's like, oh, it's Pergamum. Like maybe it's Pergamum. Anyway, one of the churches
They're
out of the
beloved.
7 is like, you're doing a great job, love you guys. Everybody else, it's like, well, you're doing all these great things, but you've left your first love. Like you're Ephesus, you're an unfaithful
And those
spouse.
letters are terrifying, by the way, because Christ dictated them to St. John and he wrote them down, right? That's the only thing we have that's like that, where it's literally like he dictated a letter to us. I mean, it's terrifying to me to read those.
And by the way, Ephesus, that was St. John's church. Like he had just been the bishop of that before he got exiled to Patmos, when, Christ is saying, like, to your church, to your congregation, you guys have left your first love. Like Timothy is the bishop of Ephesus.
Yeah,
Like the
this
apostle
is it.
Timothy is the bishop of Ephesus, probably when that letter is being dictated by Christ to that church. Right.
So
You
like
think about
even
this
St.
stuff.
John's not off the hook. This is very, very classically
Yeah,
Orthodox.
it's
Nobody's
rough. I
off the
mean,
hook.
it's a lot of those letters are really rough, but also like the idea, like, I know you're where Satan's seat is and all this different, there's the 2 different kingdoms that are active in the world and all of this different stuff. That is a cosmic reality, which is always true at every period in history. And you could say that again, the material causes, those shift around and change, but revelation is it's the correct way to actually view history. And that's really what
In the
Matthew
word,
is
right?
doing.
Apocalypse is the pulling back of a curtain, right? He's pulling back the curtain and showing actually how reality is working, right? And it's not just how reality worked then or in the future, it's how reality works right now, right? That is relevant right now. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to sort of articulate when I'm talking about sacred history, is to have the curtain of reality pulled back and to see how reality actually
That's
functions. Because like if we could see,
That's right.
I'm not alone in this room right now. There are spiritual beings here, right?
Well, you're giving me goosebumps, man, because
right?
that's why you can say
that's reality, right? The thoughts that we have are not all ours. Some of them are brought to us by outside parties, right? Once we understand reality, it changes the whole way you look at life, the whole way you walk through your day, right? It breaks you a little bit, right? I want to read something really quick because I think this really informs the way I look at history. It's from 2 Kings / 4th Kingdoms, chapter 6. This is about Elisha, the prophet Elisha. When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" He said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha.
And this miracle is exactly duplicated on the feast of what we call the protection of the Mother of God, or the Pokrov, which is a really big part, especially in the Slavic tradition. Ironic for history purposes, but it is what it is. And in this miracle, it's a fool for Christ and his disciple, Saint Andrew, I think, and his disciple, and he asks God to open the eyes of his disciple. And his disciples' eyes are open. This is when Constantinople is under siege, I think, by the Bulgars, or some other. I think it's the Bulgars. And what he sees is exactly the same vision, except that what has changed since the time of Elisha is the incarnation of the Word, that God has become man. And so he doesn't just see angels protecting the city. He sees the Mother of God spreading out her mantle over it. He sees human beings who have now become gods, who have been divinized, right? And they're now actively partaking in the spiritual protection of the people of God. But it's in full continuity. Those two things exist in the same world. If you want to say, oh, that thing never happened, then there's no reason to believe the story about Elisha either.
Yeah.
Well, I would argue that there's no reason to believe that the Slavic group with Bulgars or whoever besieged Constantinople, right? Because our sources,
right, sure, yeah.
all our sources for that
all of
You
our
know.
sources for that are Orthodox Christians. So why would we?
I mean, a lot of the sources for the Byzantine history is this man, Saint Theophanes, the confessor, who was who wrote a year by year history of the world, or of the empire, but of the world, and he matter of factly is pointing out these miraculous events while also recounting battles and all of that. These things are it's all together. There's only one story.
Yeah, Matthew, your insistence is great because my mind is stretching it out. And it does end with a little God testifying before Congress, with the most powerful man in the world testifying before Congress. You're right. It does. It ends like that. If you start with the right thing, it ends with that. Yeah. And so, yeah, but it's a tough thing to stay consistent within the spiritual, within the sacred history. Yeah. Guys, so why don't you update us before we hang up before we finish? OSI, your work, Matthew, is there anything you want us to know?
We have the Orthodox Studies Institute at St. Constantine College. I'm pouring a lot into that right now. We're doing data analysis, and we're doing history, and we're doing all kinds of stuff. So you can learn about it, orthodoxstudies.org. I write about church history at orthodoxhistory.org.
I saw an excellent podcast where you were talking about the nature of the clerical, shall we say, shortfall in terms of
the
numbers.
Priest shortage. There's like a
The priest
numerical shortage. You know, what's funny is I'm over here talking about sacred history, and I also, like, we do all kinds of data analytics. And to me, that's just like, but why is that weird? But it does seem a little weird to people.
It is weird for some people, yeah.
It seems weird to me. On
that video lit a
yeah.
fire under a lot of people, which is really good. So
Richard, tell us about what you're up to. You guys
I think most people know that I work with Jonathan Pageau on the Symbolic World Press. I kind of run the day-to-day there. We have books coming out all the time. You can just go to thesymbolicworld.com. We have courses coming out all the time. I'll be doing a course a little bit later this year with Jonathan on Dante's Paradiso, which is a concluding book of the Divine Comedy. We've already done the first two. I also have a course that will be coming out later this year on Tolkien's Legendarium as universal history, which I'm really excited about because I have a lot of research that I've been sitting on and have never actually talked about, even all of the podcasts that I've done on Tolkien. So it's kind of like exciting to talk about that for the first time. And I'm also, speaking of Father Andrew Stephen Damick, I'm also on a podcast with him called The Great Tales. It's a live show on Thursdays, every other Thursday. Our next episode comes out this week, and it's going to be on the Holy Grail. So it's just like lots of cool things happening. Check it out if you like stories, if you like just taking the stuff cold stone seriously. That is what I'm about.
By the way, I didn't roast you at Symbolic World Conference you just said the word that my joke actually uses to roast you, the word legendarium. You use that as if everyone knows what that is.
Yeah, well, you have to just come and take the course if you don't know. So
I love you guys. Thanks for coming on. You help us out because we're over here trying to do the art thing with sending people in different parts of the world. Thank you guys. So
thanks for having us.
We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Many blessings to you guys. You guys helping me run a podcast that is, I think, properly slowly growing. That's what I think. If it grew too fast, then I would have had to manipulate an algorithm. Or said things like this. Building 7. Or worse than Building 7, I don't know. I'd have to talk about like Epstein and stuff, which is actually interesting. Mossad. If I said Mossad a lot. Be in touch. Lots of cool people coming on. And 2025 is going to be a podcast fun time. www.first-things.org. Go there right now. Become a monthly donor. It's our number one thing. Just do it. We love you. From the land of South Carolina, come visit our KP restaurant. Peace out.